The air was thick with the scent of spring, a strange mixture of blooming lilacs and damp earth, as Margaret sat at her kitchen table staring at the letter in her hands. The handwriting was neat, precise, a stark contrast to the emotional weight the words carried. It was from her son, Jack, the one who had insisted for months that the time had come for her to move into a nursing home. Her hands trembled slightly as she reread the letter, though she had already read it countless times over the past week. "Mom," it began, "we love you more than anything, and we just want what's best for you. But we all think it's time. The doctors say it would be safer, and the nursing home will take care of everything. You don't have to worry about anything. We can visit often, and you'll make new friends. Please consider this seriously. You deserve peace of mind, and we think this is the right decision." Margaret had always prided herself on her independence. Born and raised in a small town in the Midwest, she had raised her 3 children on her own after her husband passed away unexpectedly 25 years ago. She'd worked hard to provide for them, juggling 2 jobs while ensuring that they never felt the absence of their father. Even after they grew up and moved away, Margaret had managed to keep her life on track, relying on no one but herself. She was proud of the life she had built in her small, modest home, a place filled with memories, love, and the comforting familiarity of decades spent within its walls. But now, at 75, her body was no longer as strong as it once was. The arthritis in her knees had become nearly unbearable, and there were days when she could hardly manage to get out of bed without assistance. Her vision was deteriorating, and her hearing wasn't what it used to be. A few months ago, she had fallen while carrying a basket of laundry up the stairs, bruising her hip badly. The doctors had warned her that it could have been much worse, and that if she continued living alone, she would eventually be at risk for even more serious accidents. Her children, Jack, Lisa, and Emma, had tried to be supportive. They had suggested hiring a home nurse, which she flatly refused, not wanting anyone poking around in her personal life. They'd offered to take turns coming over more frequently, but with their busy lives and families, she knew it was only a temporary solution. Eventually, the talk had turned to a nursing home. At first, she had brushed it off as a casual suggestion, but Jack had become more insistent, bringing it up more often, talking about how much safer it would be for her. Now, after months of quiet resistance and careful evasion, Margaret found herself staring at the reality of what might be the next chapter of her life. The letter was the tipping point. Her son's plea weighed heavily on her heart, but more than that, it stirred something deep inside of her, a fierce desire to retain control over her own life for as long as she could. She set the letter down on the table, folding her hands together tightly in front of her. The room felt unusually quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the old wall clock in the corner. She had always found comfort in the familiar sounds of her home. The creak of the floors, the hum of the refrigerator, the chirping of birds outside her window. But today, the silence felt oppressive, like a reminder of all that was slipping away from her. Her thoughts wandered back to her childhood. She had grown up in this very town, just a few blocks away from where she lived now. Her parents, both immigrants who had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, had instilled in her a sense of resilience and independence that she had carried with her throughout her life. Margaret had never been one to ask for help. She had always figured things out on her own. Even when her husband, Richard, passed away, she had managed to keep everything together for the sake of her children. But now, that same spirit of independence felt like a double-edged sword. There were times when she was afraid to admit that she could no longer do everything herself. She hated asking for help, even from her children, but the truth was that her strength was slowly slipping away. It wasn't just the physical limitations that were starting to catch up with her. It was the emotional toll of knowing that she couldn't keep pretending she was fine when deep down she wasn't. Her daughter, Lisa, had come over a few days ago and, after a long discussion about her health, had gently suggested the idea of moving into a nursing home. At first, Margaret had been furious. "You think I'm just going to throw away everything I've worked for?" She had snapped. "You think I'm ready to sit around and wait to die?" Lisa had been taken aback by her outburst, but Margaret knew her daughter was only trying to help. The frustration had come not from Lisa's concern, but from the realization that maybe they were right. Maybe it was time. Margaret had spent the next few days trying to avoid the inevitable. She focused on mundane tasks, folding laundry, watering her plants, making herself a pot of soup. But it was all just a distraction. The truth was unavoidable. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The fall, the frequent fatigue, the difficulty getting in and out of bed, all of it was proof that her body was failing her. Sitting at the table now, Margaret couldn't help but feel a sense of grief. She wasn't just losing her health. She was losing her sense of control. It was one thing to know your body was aging, but it was another thing entirely to face the reality of it. She thought of her house, the home where she had raised her children, where she had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays with Richard before he passed. There were too many memories here, too many moments that defined her identity. This house was a part of her. Maybe it's not so bad, she whispered aloud, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, herself or the house. Maybe I could be happy in a place like that. It's not so different from living here, is it? But deep down, she knew the truth. A nursing home wasn't her home. It would never be. She didn't want to be around strangers, even if they were kind, even if they took care of her. She didn't want to live in a place that felt like a waiting room for the end of life. She wasn't ready to surrender to that yet. Margaret stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the small garden in her backyard. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the flowers she had planted years ago. The sight of them made her feel a flicker of hope. This was her life. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. A decision began to form in her mind, one she knew would be difficult but necessary. She wasn't going to move into a nursing home. Not yet, at least. She would find a way to manage on her own. It might mean accepting help from her children or getting a nurse to come in occasionally, but she would not give up her home. She would not let it slip through her fingers. With a sense of determination that surprised even herself, Margaret walked back to the table and picked up the letter from Jack. She folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. She wasn't ready to explain her decision to her children yet. She needed time to figure out how she would make this work. As she turned off the lights and made her way upstairs to bed, Margaret felt a sense of calm settle over her. The decision had been made, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she had regained control of her life. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The first few weeks after Margaret's decision not to move into the nursing home felt like walking a tightrope. Each day was a delicate balance between the reality of her physical limitations and her overwhelming desire to maintain her independence. At the beginning, there was an odd sort of exhilaration. It was as though she had taken control of her life once more, and that sense of agency made her feel stronger. But as the days turned into weeks, the harshness of reality set in. Her joints ached constantly. Every morning, Margaret struggled to lift herself from the bed, the pain in her knees sharp and unrelenting. She had long ago traded her favorite pair of high heels for orthopedic shoes, and even they seemed to offer little comfort now. The arthritis had crept in slowly, insidiously, but now it felt like a permanent guest in her body, one that was never going to leave. One morning, as Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, taking slow, deep breaths to prepare for the effort it would take to get dressed, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. The mental effort required to push through each day was as draining as the physical. She thought about calling her daughter, Emma, or even her son, Jack, for help, but the idea of it made her stomach twist. She had promised herself she would do this on her own, and asking for help now would be a failure. At least, that was what she convinced herself. Besides, the children had their own lives, their own families, their own problems to deal with. They didn't need the burden of her weakness. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the isolation that was the hardest part to bear. When she was young, her house had been filled with laughter and voices, her children running around, friends visiting, and the constant hum of daily life. But now, the silence was deafening. Her closest friends had either moved away or passed on, and though she kept in touch with a few acquaintances over the phone, the loneliness in her heart was undeniable. Margaret tried to keep herself busy. She found comfort in simple tasks, folding laundry, sweeping the floors, tending to her plants, but it was often hard to muster the energy. Cooking was another challenge. She had always loved to prepare meals, especially for family gatherings, but now it felt like an insurmountable task. The stove seemed farther away, the refrigerator too far to reach. Each meal felt like a small victory, but it was only a matter of time before she would run out of energy, or worse, forget something vital like the pot on the stove or the pan in the oven. One afternoon, she was preparing her lunch when she dropped a glass jar of jam on the floor. It shattered into pieces, and for a long moment, Margaret just stared at the mess, the sticky red remnants spreading across the tile like a scarlet wound. She didn't have the energy to clean it up. Not right now. The thought of bending down to pick up the shards made her stomach turn. Her knees were already sore from the walk around the house, and the idea of crouching to scrub the floor seemed impossible. But there it was, the mess, and the reminder that she was no longer the same woman she had been even a few years ago. She eventually called a cleaning service, feeling the sharp sting of defeat as she did so. But the cleaning woman, a woman named Irene who was in her mid-30s, was kind and understanding. She didn't judge Margaret for the mess, nor did she make her feel like an inconvenience. Irene simply went about her work, scrubbing the floor, replacing broken items, and tidying up the kitchen. By the time she finished, Margaret felt a sense of relief that was accompanied by an undeniable sense of shame. She had to accept that she couldn't do everything by herself anymore. The following days were a blur of more struggles. Simple tasks like showering became overwhelming. Margaret found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection, wondering who the woman was staring back at her. She barely recognized the older version of herself. She had never been a vain woman, but seeing the lines on her face deepen, the color in her hair fade, and the frailty in her posture was a shock. She wasn't sure who she had become, but it was certainly not the woman she had been just a few years ago. The next challenge came when Margaret went to the grocery store. She had always loved shopping for food. There was something therapeutic about strolling through the aisles, picking out fresh produce, and carefully choosing the ingredients for her favorite recipes. But now, the task felt monumental. She had to plan her trip in advance, knowing that she would need a cart to lean on and a rest in between the aisles. At one point, she had to sit on the small bench in the middle of the store, exhausted from the effort of pushing the cart and lifting items onto the conveyor belt. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so helpless, so small in the vastness of the store. When she returned home, there was no one to help her unload the groceries. She struggled with the bags, dragging them inside one by one, and managed to get them onto the kitchen counter, but it was a slow, painful process. Her knees were aching by the time she finished, and her arms were sore from the effort. The simple act of putting away food had become an ordeal, a reminder of just how much things had changed. She stood in her kitchen, looking at the piles of cans and bags, feeling overwhelmed. How much longer could she continue like this? At the same time, she refused to let herself dwell on the negative. Every time the self-pity began to creep in, she pushed it aside. Margaret wasn't one to wallow in despair. She had lived too many years to let the small things get to her. But there were days when the reality of her situation felt like too much to bear. It wasn't just the physical challenges. There were emotional struggles, too. Margaret had always been proud of her ability to take care of herself. But now, as the days passed, she found herself questioning everything. Was she really making the right decision? Maybe Jack and Emma were right. Maybe it would be easier to move into a place where she didn't have to struggle every day. Maybe a nursing home would offer her the peace she desperately longed for, the quiet refuge from the battle that had become her life. But every time the thought crept in her mind, she pushed it back. She wasn't ready to give up yet. There were too many memories here, too many connections to the life she had built. The house, the neighborhood, the people she knew, everything was a part of her identity. She wasn't ready to give all of that up. As the weeks dragged on, Margaret began to consider alternatives. She couldn't keep doing everything on her own, but she didn't want to move to a nursing home. She began looking into hiring a part-time caregiver, someone who could come by a few times a week to help with the heavy tasks like cleaning and grocery shopping. It wasn't an easy decision. She still wasn't comfortable asking for help, but the idea of having someone there to assist her gave her a small sense of relief. Her first experience with a caregiver came a week later. Her name was Ruth, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor and a gentle smile. Ruth arrived promptly on the agreed-upon day, and they spent the first few hours together chatting about everything from the weather to the old books on Margaret's shelves. Ruth was understanding and patient, and Margaret found herself feeling more at ease than she had expected. It wasn't like a nursing home. Ruth wasn't there to hover over her. She was there to lend a hand when Margaret needed it. By the end of the week, Margaret felt more empowered. She realized that it wasn't a failure to accept help. It was a way to maintain her independence while ensuring she could continue to live in her own home. She wasn't giving up. She was adapting. Though the road ahead would still be filled with struggles, Margaret had learned something important in those first few weeks. She had learned that there was strength in vulnerability, that it was okay to admit that she needed help. It didn't make her weak. It made her resilient. And as she sat in her living room that evening, with Ruth helping her organize a few things around the house, Margaret felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could make this work. Margaret had never been one to ask for help, and even after deciding to remain in her home, it took time for her to adjust to the new reality of needing assistance. Ruth, the caregiver, had been a godsend in many ways. She came 3 times a week, offering help with heavy cleaning and organizing. Margaret didn't need Ruth's help with everything, but there were days when she was simply too tired, too sore, or too drained to do even the most mundane tasks. Those were the days when Ruth would come in, a quiet presence, and lend a hand. But while Ruth's presence was undoubtedly a relief, it didn't fill the void of loneliness that often crept into Margaret's life. Ruth wasn't a friend. She was a worker, albeit a kind and considerate one, but their relationship was built on professional boundaries. Margaret needed someone who wasn't just there to help with chores, but who would also sit down and talk to her, share a cup of tea, and laugh together. She missed the kind of companionship she had once had in her younger years when the house was always full of the chatter and laughter of her children and friends. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon when things began to change. Margaret had just returned from a short walk in her neighborhood, feeling the familiar ache in her knees with each step. Her physical therapy sessions had been helping somewhat, but the road to recovery felt long, and some days she could hardly bring herself to leave the house. Today had been one of those days. She'd managed a quick errand at the post office, but after that, she had felt exhausted and discouraged. The thought of sitting around for the rest of the day was unbearable, so she decided to take a short walk, despite her body's protests. As she walked along the familiar streets, she spotted a woman sitting on the porch of the house 2 doors down. Margaret had seen the woman before, a young mother with 2 small children. Margaret often exchanged pleasantries with her when they happened to be out at the same time, but they had never really had a conversation. The woman, Sarah, always seemed to be busy, rushing around with her children or chatting with neighbors. Margaret had heard that Sarah worked from home as a freelance writer, a job that allowed her to juggle caring for her children while earning a living. Today, Sarah waved to Margaret as she approached. Margaret, she called, her voice friendly and warm. Margaret smiled and waved back, making her way toward the porch. Hello, Sarah, she said, though she had no real intention of stopping. The cold breeze had picked up, and she just wanted to get inside. But Sarah's inviting smile made her pause. You look like you're heading home, Sarah said. Would you like to come sit for a while? I'm just making some tea, and the kids are napping. Margaret hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't like Sarah. It was simply that she was unused to accepting invitations. But there was something about Sarah's warm tone that made Margaret feel as though she had no reason to refuse. Besides, she could already feel the weight of the day's exhaustion settling in. A cup of tea didn't seem like a terrible idea. Well, I suppose a cup of tea wouldn't hurt, Margaret said, her voice lighter than it had been in weeks. Sarah's face brightened, and she stood up, motioning for Margaret to come onto the porch. Please come on in. It's cold out here. The inside of Sarah's house was cozy, filled with the faint scent of cinnamon and lavender. There were toys scattered around the living room, and a few family photos adorned the walls. Margaret noticed the framed picture of Sarah and her husband at their wedding, a joyful moment frozen in time. Margaret smiled to herself, reminded of the many happy occasions in her own life, when Richard had been by her side, and the house had been filled with the same kind of laughter and chaos that Sarah's home seemed to possess. Sarah led Margaret into the kitchen, where a small kettle of water was heating on the stove. "I'm sorry about the mess," she said as she began setting out 2 cups. "I didn't expect company today." Margaret shook her head. "You're fine, dear. It's a home, after all." Sarah smiled, clearly relieved, and poured the hot water into the cups. "I hope you don't mind chamomile. It's the only kind I have at the moment, but I think it's perfect for a chilly day like today." "I'm not picky," Margaret replied with a smile. "Chamomile will do just fine." They sat down at the small kitchen table, the steam from their tea rising in the quiet air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret wasn't sure how to begin the conversation. It had been so long since she had sat down with someone for no other reason than to enjoy a simple moment of connection. The silence between them felt comfortable, though, and after a few moments, Margaret decided to speak. "I've been meaning to tell you," Margaret began slowly, her voice soft, "how much I admire how you manage everything. You're always so together. You have your hands full with the kids, but you still manage to stay so calm." Sarah chuckled, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of humor and humility. "I don't know about that," she said, shaking her head. "Some days, I feel like I'm barely keeping it together. It's tough, juggling everything, but I do what I can." Margaret smiled gently. She could see that Sarah was far from perfect, but she also saw something else, a deep sense of care and commitment. Sarah wasn't trying to appear flawless. She was simply doing her best, just as Margaret had done when her own children were young. "How old are your children now?" Margaret asked, eager to shift the conversation towards something lighter. "Tommy's 4, and Ellie's 2, Sarah said, her voice softening as she spoke about them. "They keep me busy, but they're a joy. It's amazing how much they change every day." Margaret nodded, a nostalgic ache tugging at her heart. "I remember when my kids were that age," she said. "It feels like it was just yesterday. The noise, the mess, it was all part of the adventure." "I can only imagine," Sarah said, her voice warm. "I know I complain sometimes, but I know it's all fleeting. They'll grow up so fast." Margaret's eyes softened as she looked out the window, her thoughts drifting. She had known that feeling, the feeling of time slipping by faster than she could grasp. But what struck her now was the way Sarah spoke about her children, with such joy and tenderness. It reminded her of how she used to feel when her own children were young, how the world had seemed to stretch out ahead of them, full of possibility. "I envy you," Margaret said quietly, surprising even herself. "You're so full of life. You've still got everything ahead of you." Sarah blinked, taken aback by the remark, but then her expression softened. "Oh, Margaret, you have so much to give still. You might be older, but your life's not over. You've lived a full, rich life. You've raised children, seen the world change, experienced things I can only imagine. That's something to be proud of." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she had been yearning for validation, for someone to acknowledge the weight of her years. It wasn't that she wanted to dwell in the past, but she longed for someone to see her, not just as a woman struggling with old age, but as the person she had been all along, strong, resilient, and capable. Sarah reached across the table and took Margaret's hand gently, a small but sincere gesture. "You've got more strength in you than you know," she said softly. "And you've got people who care about you, even if you don't always feel like it. You're not alone." The words hit Margaret like a wave, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a surge of emotion that she couldn't suppress. She had spent so many months fighting against the inevitable, trying to keep the world at arm's length. But in that moment, surrounded by Sarah's kindness, Margaret felt the cracks in her walls begin to soften. "I appreciate that," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I really do. It's been hard, you know? But I think I'm starting to realize that I don't have to do everything on my own. It's just hard for me to ask for help. I've always been independent." "I get it," Sarah said, her voice reassuring. "But sometimes, asking for help is the bravest thing you can do." Margaret nodded, feeling a sense of release in her chest. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe, for the first time in her life, it was okay to let others in, to lean on them when she needed to. She didn't have to do everything alone, and she didn't have to carry the weight of the world by herself. As they sat and finished their tea, Margaret realized that this small moment, this unexpected connection, had shifted something inside her. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. She had been given the gift of genuine, heartfelt support, and for the first time in months, she felt hopeful. The days following her afternoon tea with Sarah felt different. Margaret had spent so much of her life compartmentalizing, hiding her weaknesses and pretending to be invincible. She had tried to carry the weight of her age, her physical decline, and her loneliness by herself. But in that quiet moment, when Sarah had shared her vulnerability and encouragement, Margaret felt a shift deep within. It was as if she had finally allowed herself to be seen in her entirety, not just as an independent woman trying to survive on her own, but as someone deserving of companionship, support, and care. Though she was still adjusting to this new mindset, Margaret felt lighter in the days that followed. Ruth continued to come over a few times a week, but now Margaret wasn't so hesitant to accept her help. She asked Ruth to stay for a cup of tea afterward, and although the conversations were still more about logistics, scheduling cleaning days, and organizing tasks, there was an unspoken shift in their relationship. Ruth became not just a caregiver, but a friend. But the real turning point came the following weekend when Emma, Margaret's daughter, came to visit. Emma had been calling regularly, checking in on her mother, but there was an undertone of concern in her voice each time. Margaret knew her daughter well enough to sense that the phone calls were more about checking her well-being than genuine conversation. The distance between them had always been palpable, but as time passed, it had grown wider. Emma had her own family, a busy career, and a life that required her attention. Margaret had never wanted to be a burden to her. That Saturday, when Emma arrived, there was something different in her mother's demeanor. Margaret had spent the week reflecting on her life, sorting through the pain of the past, and deciding that she didn't need to keep pushing everyone away anymore. She didn't need to apologize for her age or her struggles. She needed to accept that those things were a part of who she was now, and in doing so, she could let others in. "Hi, Mom," Emma said, giving her mother a tight hug as she stepped inside the house. Margaret smiled warmly, appreciating the embrace despite the familiar pang of guilt that always accompanied it. Emma was always so busy. Margaret hated that she had to rely on her, and yet, in that moment, she realized how deeply she missed their closeness. "I'm glad you could make it, Emma," Margaret said, gesturing to the kitchen where the tea was already brewing. "How's everything going with the kids?" Emma sat down at the table, taking a deep breath as if preparing to engage in a serious conversation. "They're doing great. Timmy's been growing like a weed, and Grace is starting to walk. But you, Mom?" Emma paused, her expression shifting. "We've been talking about this, and I think it's time we have an honest conversation." Margaret felt her heart sink. She knew what was coming. She could hear the tone in Emma's voice, the mixture of concern and guilt. Emma had been pushing the idea of Margaret moving into a nursing home for months, and despite Margaret's steadfast refusal, it seemed like the topic was back on the table. "I know you don't want to hear it," Emma continued, "but I'm really worried about you. I'm seeing how hard it's becoming for you to do things on your own. You shouldn't have to struggle like this, Mom. I just want you to be safe, and I think a nursing home might be the right decision." Margaret's pulse quickened. The familiar feeling of resistance, of wanting to argue, of wanting to be the strong, independent woman that she had always been, bubbled up inside her. But instead of shutting down or getting defensive, something inside her shifted. The past few months had taught her to open up, to let go of the belief that she needed to carry everything alone. "Emma," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm, "I know you're worried, and I know you think a nursing home is the answer, but I'm telling you now, it's not. I've spent my life working for my independence, and I'm not ready to give that up just yet. But," she paused, trying to find the words, "I don't want you to feel like I'm refusing help. I've started looking into other options, things that can help me stay here at home a bit longer. I'm not doing this on my own anymore, and that's okay. I'm accepting help from Ruth, from Sarah, and even from people in the neighborhood who check on me. Emma was quiet for a moment, and Margaret could see the conflict in her daughter's eyes. Emma wanted to do what was best for her mother, but the traditional answer of a nursing home seemed to be the only solution she could offer. "I know this isn't easy, Mom," Emma said after a pause, "but I need you to understand that it's not just about your independence. It's about your health, your safety. You're getting older. I don't want to see you struggle, not when there are options out there that can make things easier." Margaret looked at her daughter, her gaze softening. "I understand, darling, but I'm not ready to be put away in a home. Maybe that day will come, but not yet. Not now." Emma didn't reply right away. She just sat there, taking in her mother's words. After a long silence, she finally nodded. "Okay, Mom, I hear you. I just want you to be happy. I just want you to be okay." Her voice cracked slightly, and Margaret could hear the unshed tears in her daughter's words. "I don't want you to feel alone." Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand on top of Emma's. It felt warm, steady. "You're not alone either, Emma. I'm not asking you to take care of me. I just need you to know that I'm okay, and that I'm learning to accept help when I need it. It's hard, but I'm trying." The conversation didn't end with an easy resolution, but for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like she had been heard. The weight of her daughter's concern was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been before. Emma had understood, even if she hadn't fully agreed. Margaret realized that accepting help didn't make her weak or less independent. It made her stronger. It was a balance she was learning to strike. The rest of the weekend passed peacefully. Emma stayed for dinner, and they spent the evening together, reminiscing about old family stories and sharing the comfortable silences that only those who truly know each other can share. It wasn't the same as the bustling, chaotic days of Margaret's youth, but it was enough. By the time Emma left, Margaret felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She had made her decision. She wasn't going to let fear of losing her independence dictate the course of her life. She wasn't going to let pride keep her isolated from those who cared about her. She would take one day at a time, accepting the support she needed when it came, but never giving up on the woman she had always been. The next morning, Margaret went for another walk. This time, it felt different. She no longer carried the weight of her decision as a burden, nor did she feel like a failure for needing help. As she walked slowly through the neighborhood, breathing in the fresh air, she realized something. The true essence of independence wasn't in doing everything by herself. It was in having the strength to ask for help when it was needed, and the wisdom to know that she didn't have to carry every burden alone. Margaret didn't know what the future held, and she didn't need to. She knew that she had made the right choice for now. She was home, surrounded by familiar things, with a new perspective on life. Her days were quieter now, but they were filled with moments of peace that she had long since forgotten to appreciate. And so, as the days continued to unfold, Margaret found a new kind of freedom, not in the endless struggle for independence, but in the understanding that accepting help didn't diminish her strength, it enhanced it. And in that simple truth, she found the peace she had been searching for all along.